Now that we have learned the basics of creating a flip simulation and learn about sourcing from a sub-object, we will learn to create an ocean source, and we will also learn to create white water. So this is what we're going to create in the following exercise. In this specific exercise, I will use a closed container just to optimize a bit the amount of data that we're going to generate. But in our final exercise, we will use a much larger container, and we will also avoid the bounce of the waves using a boundary layer. So let's take a look at the starting file. I have created a camera, and here is the RBD simulation. I won't go through the RBD simulation because the purpose of this course is to go through the flip solver, but feel free to dive in and take a look at how this was done. You may want to cache the simulation in your own machine, but still the simulation is quite simple and probably there's not even need to cache it. So let's first of all create a geometry node. Let's call this one splash. Dive in and press the tab key. So this time, as I mentioned, we're going to use an ocean source to create not only the initial particles, but also the initial bounce. So if you take a look at the ocean source, we also have a particle separation as we did on the flip solver. We have the size of the domain and the center. So let's start by setting the size. So let's use 15, 10, and 15 meters. And notice by default, the ocean source will initialize to wave tank. So make sure to change this option to flat tank. Now, if you look at the edges of the domain, we have a second cube inside, and this is showing us the boundary layer. So if you go to the boundary layer tab, you will notice how by default this option is on. And we will use this option on our larger tank on our final exercise. For now, I'm going to turn this off. Go back to the particles tab. And one thing you probably want to set up before we begin is the water level. So by default, the water level is at Y0, which in most of the cases, that's fine. In this particular exercise, I will also bring the domain upward just a little bit. Maybe change the center Y to 4 meters, just to have a little bit more space for the splashes. And although the domain may be small for this particular exercise, it will help us to accelerate the simulations and make the tutorial a little bit more fluid. So I'll go back to my camera view. I think we're ready to create our simulation. So I will create a null. I'll connect it to my ocean source and call this out ocean source. I'll change its color to black. And now I will create my DOP network. Call this DOP splash and change the color. I will double click on the DOP network to dive in. So as usual, we will need a gravity. So add a gravity node. I will also add a merge. So remember, we'll use the merge to connect some static geometry or colliders to the simulation. And actually, I will prepare that static object node because I know I will merge in the RBD simulation. And I will drop down a flip solver, connect it to the merge, And of course, we will need our flip object. I will connect that to the first input of the flip solver. Now, if you remember, the initial data is using this default object, the default fluid. And here is where I want to connect my ocean source instead. So click on this button to the right, the operator chooser. And under the splash geometry, look for the out ocean source. Now, the input type is by default set to surface SOP. So we need to change this to particle field. And as we did on the first exercise, I'm going to change the display of the particles. So go to the guides folder, look for the particles folder, and change the visualization to particles. Okay, so maybe you noticed that the domain is larger than my ocean source. So what I'm going to do is to channel reference the size of my ocean source into my volume here. So select the flip solver. Just as a reminder, the size of the domain is under the volume motion. So this is what I'm going to channel reference. So I'm going to go back to the SOP level, select my ocean source. I'm going to right click on the size, copy the parameter, and perhaps we can also create a bookmark here. So Control 2 to create a quick mark. Then I'll go back to my DOP network. I can press Control 3 to create another bookmark. And let's channel reference the size of the ocean source here. So right click on the box size, paste relative reference. Now press the number 2 key to return to my ocean source and copy the center position. So copy parameter, go back to my DOP network and channel reference under box center. So click on paste relative reference. And I think we're almost ready to simulate. Just one small thing missing. If you try pressing play currently, remember by default the domain is an open domain, so the particles will fall. We need to fix that. I will create a completely closed box. So select your flip object node. Make sure to click on closed boundaries. And just to make sure everything's okay, you can press play again. And you will have the fluid particles now colliding with the bounds.